Ladies and gentlemen, two preliminary observations, one heartfelt, and that is thanks. I've actually never had a conference as a birthday party before, and it's really rather a nice experience. Thank you for joining me at it. I want to express my gratitude to the organisers from the Institute of Faith and Learning and all those who have helped them, and especially to Tommy Kidd for his remarks just now. My second observation is this. Last weekend at this university, I attended a conference on Baptist history, another of my hobbies. Now we have one on secularization revival, how marvellous. At Baylor, there is no need for me to go to conferences. The conferences come to me. It is a marvellous arrangement which I very much appreciate. My subject this evening is the intellectual Christianity of Victorian Weardale. Revivalism is usually supposed to be antithetical to intellect. In particular, the type of popular evangelicalism typified by Methodism that went in for revivals during the 19th century is commonly seen as near the opposite pole of religion to reflection. It's not thought through in the manner, say, of the Oxford movement. Whereas the Oxford movement is considered a fit subject for intellectual historians, Methodism is generally left to the social historians. A classic of the historical literature, E.P. Thompson's Making of the English Working Class, 1963, did much to fix this image of Methodism as a species of mindless fanaticism. Thompson contends that Methodist revivalism in the early years of the 19th century included what he calls hysteria as an intrinsic element. It was partly, he claims, an anguished response of the common people to repression in the aftermath of the French Revolution, a chiliasm of despair that pointed converts to the heavens in order to avoid the despair of earth. Ideas, other than wild visions, were notably absent. The Methodist concern with schooling, according to Thompson, was not intended to be truly educational, but was designed to indoctrinate, soon merging with the contemporary utilitarian desire to propagate useful knowledge among the workers so that they would submit to nascent industrialism. Methodism, Thompson concludes, was a strongly anti-intellectual force. This view of the Methodist movement has exerted a powerful influence over subsequent historiography. There have been different interpretations, notably David Hempton's study of Methodism, Empire of the Spirit, 2005, proposing that Methodists were indeed enthusiasts, but deeply indebted to the Age of Reason. Yet the Thompson paradigm retains much of its sway. Methodist revivalism is believed to have been hostile to the life of the mind. Primitive Methodism, an English denomination that broke away from the Wesleyan parent body in order to be free to foster awakenings, is normally held to have expressed the quintessence of the revivalist temper. In the first decade of the 19th century, the fathers of the denomination, then still Wesleyans, took up the American innovation of vigorous evangelistic camp meetings. The Wesleyan authorities were displeased. "It is our judgment," recorded the British Conference solemnly, "that even supposing such meetings to be allowable in America, they are highly improper in England and likely to be productive of considerable mischief, and we disclaim all connection with them." The promoters of camp meetings refused to drop the new technique and so emerged as a separate organisation, taking the name Primitive to show that they were reviving the original spirit of Methodism. Julia Werner has analysed the earliest years of the new movement, demonstrating that it grew because of the dynamic of revivalism. Although one of its founders, Hugh Bourne, was a capable organiser, the other, William Clowes, was a fervent preacher who drew even more zealous men into the young connection. One of them, Praying Johnny Oxterby, was an eccentric character whose preaching created extraordinary effects. At Leicester in 1826, for example, Oxtoby reported that the Lord stretched forth his helping hand. He went on, "There was not only a great shaking, but a great number of persons fell to the ground. They actually were strewed all over the floor of the sacred house. Some were crying aloud for mercy, and some were made happy in God and loudly sang his praises." Bourne provided a magazine, but he was sceptical of human learning. He expressed satisfaction when an early member left off a variety of books and sold some of them, and now he looks more to God to open the scriptures. The preachers had no training whatsoever down to the 1860s. The primitives, Henry Rack has shown, placed great emphasis on dreams, visions, foretelling, healing, providential judgments, the devil and witchcraft. So the primitive Methodists appear in the secondary literature not as people of studious disposition, but as earnest revivalists eager to spread vivid experience of the supernatural. The aim of this paper is to call in question that blanket reading of the primitive Methodists, and therefore of the revivalism of which they were an extreme example. Did zeal for revival necessarily exclude bookishness? That issue will be addressed by examining a stronghold of the denomination, Weardale in County Durham, as a case study. Weardale in the north of England is a valley extending about 15 miles from the high slopes of the Pennine Hills down to the lower lying land nearer the east coast. In the 19th century, the dale was dominated by lead mining, which in 1841 accounted for over half its employment. Although there were several townships, the largest being Stanhope with about 2,500 inhabitants in 1851, most of the miners lived in scattered homesteads, usually keeping a few animals to supplement the family economy. The widely shared form of employment gave a sense of solidarity to Weardale folk that was reinforced by the valley's relative solitude. The railway entered its lower reaches in 1847, was extended to Stanhope in 1862, but it did not reach the head of the dale until as late as 1895. In the valley, the Church of England did very poorly, securing only 14% of church attendances at the 1851 religious census. But the Methodists did exceptionally well, obtaining as high a proportion as 82%. The Wesleyan Methodists, who'd been planted in the Dale as long ago as 1748, outnumbered the primitive Methodists, but when their recent arrival in the 1820s is taken into account, the primitives had achieved a great deal in order to gain nearly two-thirds as many attendances as their rivals. They were despised by the Anglicans. The rector of Stanhope dismissed their place of worship contemptuously as a ranter chapel, and they were rather looked down on by many of the Wesleyans. But the primitive Methodists had put down strong roots in Weardale. During the 19th century, the primitives of Weardale enjoyed a rhythm of revivals. They are regarded, recounted the senior minister towards the end of the century, as principal events in the Dale and serve as a chronology. Revivalism set the tone from the start. The initial impact of primitive Methodism on the Dale in 1822 was partly due to Jane Ansdale, one of its female pioneers, as locals gathered to hear the curious phenomenon of a woman preaching. A full awakening broke out in the following year. Sinners, recounted Thomas Batty, Ansdale's colleague, fell down beneath the word. At the prayer meetings after preachings, as many as 10 or 12 together, crying for mercy. John Oxtoby passed through the Dale in 1824, with predictably explosive results. 8th of October, he wrote in his diary, preached at Westgate Chapel. A Pentecostal shower came down while singing. They began to fall over on all sides, crying, "Glory, glory, glory." There were 10 subsequent full-scale revivals in the valley down to 1875. Each was given the name of the leading minister involved, so that people spoke of McKechnie's revival in Stanhope and Lister's revival in Lane Head. After 1875, the awakenings tailed off somewhat, but a visiting evangelist triggered another in 1888. Critics censured the vulgarity, the noise, the sheer chaos of the revivalist ethos among the primitives of the valley. In prayer, declared an Anglican observer in 1840, they work themselves into a complete frenzy, sing at the stretch of their voices their hymns to some of the most popular tunes of the day, such as Scots were hey wi Wallace bled, and it does not matter whether he or she in the pulpit be preaching or praying, loud amens, praise God's, I do believe, resound and ring through the building. There can be no doubt that Weardale was a hotbed of intense and sustained revivalism. Yet, within this atmosphere, there was a remarkable concern for the intellect. One of the chief symptoms and explanations lies in the subscription library at Westgate, 6 miles up the valley from Stanhope. Begun in 1788 by 21 members who bought the initial stock of 40 volumes by contributing 4 shillings each, it was originally more of a club, with the subscribers keeping the books in their homes and exchanging them monthly for a small sum. From 1839 onwards, the stock was housed in a former public house on the main street. Membership immediately increased to 200 in the following year, and holdings reached 1,387 volumes by 1861. The institution flourished because the lead miners had time to read. The mines normally worked only 8 hours a day, beginning at 7 a.m, so that after 3 p.m, the miners' time was their own. Much of the spur to reading, however, came from Methodism. Although the stock contained works of history, biography, philosophy, literature and travel, its core was theology. The works of John Wesley and John Fletcher were prominent among the early holdings, and the second rule made in 1788 was that the choice of purchasers must be censored by the local Methodist preacher, whose views could be overturned only by a vote of 2 to 1 against him. Even then, other books might be bought only provided that they are not hurtful to morality or religion, nor are advocates for particular redemption and that chain of doctrine. Only the preacher could borrow a book from a member during a period of loan without a fine being levied on the offending subscriber, and meetings were to start and finish with singing and a prayer for blessing on the reading. The Westgate Subscription Library was almost a Methodist institution. The librarian for half a century from 1806 was John Dover Muschamp of Brotherly, 2 miles above Westgate. Muschamp was an unusual figure in the Dale, a landed proprietor, but on a very small scale, in 1851 employing only 1 servant. Nevertheless, he enjoyed some local standing, serving as a justice of the peace, and he was deeply loyal to Weardale, keeping a diary of memorable local events. When he was 29, in 1805, he joined the library, borrowing the life of Fletcher and many works by Wesley in his first 2 years as a member. Clearly, he was already a devout Methodist. When the Primitives arrived in the valley 2 decades later, he threw in his lot with them, joining the first class for mutual spiritual encouragement that they organised. Although he couldn't sing at all, he walked in procession with the primitive pioneers while all the others sang, holding his hymn book high to demonstrate his allegiance. Muschamp fostered a small chapel at Brotherly and frequently served as secretary of the General Quarter Day Board between 1836 and 1844, but his chief services to the cause were financial. As a relatively wealthy man in a poor body of people, he regularly underwrote bills, and on one occasion, when the trustees could not pay the builders, he sold a cow and gave the proceeds to the building fund. With Muschamp in charge of the library, it was natural for Primitives to join what had begun under Wesleyan auspices. Symbolically, it took in the Primitive Methodist magazine. The library had astonishing effects on the life of the valley. It was not alone, for in the 1820s and 30s there were 2 other subscription libraries in the area, and subsequently the London Lead Company, that owned some of the mines, encouraged similar institutions. But the Westgate Library was the largest and the most prestigious of them. There were also small temporary book clubs in which the subscribers divided the stock after a short while, and the Sunday schools built up libraries. The result was that an assistant to a royal commission could report in 1842 that the intellectual condition of the people was decidedly superior to that of any district of England of which I have knowledge. By 1861, in the lead mining area that embraced Weardale, 96% of the male population and 90% of the female population could read, a much higher proportion than in almost any other occupational group among the working classes elsewhere. The primitives shared largely in this literate culture. An example is Cuthbert Fairless of Rookup, 7 miles northwest of Stanhope, who worked in the lead industry as a smelter crystallizer. He served in primitive Methodism as a Sunday school teacher, class leader and lay preacher, played a full part in the revivals, and delighted to speak of the times of refreshing from the presence of the Lord. Yet, as a member of the Westgate Library, who was to become a trustee in 1881, he was also a man of books. Although living in a retired part of the country, according to his obituarist, he was well acquainted with current literature and posted himself up in ecclesiastical and political events transpiring in the world. Fairless provides a sample of the intellectual interests that were nurtured in Weardale. A more striking instance of the same phenomenon is George Race, a figure who deserves careful examination. Born in 1810, Race followed his father as a lead miner, but in the 1840s opened business as a grocer and draper in Westgate. He was deeply influenced as a boy by his grandfather, Anthony Race, who was the senior Wesleyan local preacher until his death in 1818. George was converted in 1830 in a revival under William Sanderson, who thereafter became his hero. Sanderson was imaginative, logical, and eloquent, the Whitfield of primitive Methodism, he was called, and Race willingly travelled the 25 or so miles to Newcastle upon Tyne just to hear him preach. In the year after his conversion, Race became an exhorter, delivering addresses without a biblical text, and soon a local preacher. He played a full part in the primitive Methodist affairs of the Dales over subsequent years, in 1867 acting as president of the circuit. It was Race who, at the laying of the foundation stone of the new Westgate Chapel in 1870, presented the local Member of Parliament with 2 volumes to mark the occasion. Race was reluctant, however, to attend conference, the supreme authority in the primitive Methodist connection, because he disliked the formality of its business. He once referred dismissively to denominational organisers as mechanists ecclesiastical. Rather, his delight was in the spiritual concerns of the neighbourhood. He admired, for example, an older local preacher named John Colthart, who died in 1839, for his prayer life, his conduct of his class, and his willingness to express his emotions with tears streaming down his cheeks. And Race loved revivals. When in 1851 one broke out in Stanhope, he spent much of his time there and demanded frequent reports from the minister when he was not himself present. Yet, he was also a devotee of the Westgate Library. He joined it shortly after his conversion, borrowing over the next 2 years works of history, biography, science and travel, as well as books by Fletcher and an array of sermons and commentaries. Suffering from a poor early education, he set himself to acquire a mastery of most branches of knowledge. His love of books was so great that when his wife died in 1848, he actually moved into the library house, so that downstairs was his grocery and upstairs were the books. Race, the devoted primitive revivalist, was also a self-taught scholar. He turned into a phenomenon of the valley. Race was renowned as the ablest orator in Weardale. He could be hesitant in the pulpit, searching for the right expression, and depressed about his performance. But on a good day, he showed a sublime mastery of words. At times, he would expound every detail of his text, but on other occasions, when he usually made the greatest impression, he would bring out the full significance of a single idea. His standards were high, frankly assessing the abilities of a fellow local preacher on one occasion as not first rate, and that was in print, and criticising in his later years the type who, in the quest for popularity, can spout out the productions either of his own fevered brain or those of other people. His own most celebrated address from Revelation chapter 6 was on the pale horse of death, an ever-present reality among the miners whose occupation often brought an early end to life through silicosis. His preaching, according to the Anglican who was generally critical of the primitives, is of a bold and daring description. His attitude is commanding and fearless. Words follow words in rapid succession. Thought is followed by thought, flowing faster than is desirable. His voice is strong and powerful. His memory is subservient and retentive. His sentiments are natural and correct and display self-convinced conclusions and deep research. PhD. By the age of 30, Race had many worshippers who perfectly idolise him and all he says and does. He had a fine ear, played several instruments, attaining some skill on the flute, and sang both at home and at church, taking a leading part in the services. It was thought that attendance at the debating society of the valley might ruin him. George Race, miners would mumble to each other, conquers everybody at arguing the debating meetings, but many think his religion will not be improved in such a place. What think ye? Yet his triumphs did not spoil him. He took no trouble over dress, loved trout fishing, and kept his Weardale accent. He wrote of our Dale with pride, subscribing to a local antiquarian work. Race was a dalesman through and through, but at the same time an intellectual prodigy. His theology was typical of the evangelical world of the day. Race showed an unwavering allegiance to the Bible. He wrote of testing authors by the unerring standard of God's holy word and of the scriptures being verbally infallible. His closest friend among the primitive ministers, Colin McKechnie, wrote after Race's death in 1892 that he had not read the Bible critically. But that was an anachronistic judgment made after the acceptance of higher criticism by the more advanced nonconformist thinkers. Race himself had in 1863 written favourably of the labours of biblical critics because he assumed at that date that they were aiming to clear away difficulties in the text. He believed strongly in the sinfulness of humanity and that if impenitency remain, its consummation in hell is as sure as if already accomplished. He deplored the efforts of F.D. Morris and Charles Kingsley to treat punishment beyond the grave as something less than never-ending. The only remedy for sin was the atonement of Christ. Although Race was prepared to say that Christ took only the corporate sins of humanity, not its personal sin, and so did not himself become guilty, the Weardale preacher insisted that the cross was an expression of public law, so aligning himself with the governmental theory of the atonement that prevailed in the Methodism of his day. He insisted on instantaneous conversion, a distinctive Methodist position, treating it as the greatest of miracles. There must be sustained effort, he believed, to convey this message to perishing sinners. So Race showed the characteristic hallmarks of evangelicalism: biblicism, crucicentrism, conversionism, and activism, with a particular Methodist angling. This set of theological convictions fitted into the broader framework of thought that he derived in his earlier years, primarily from the Enlightenment. The commentaries of Adam Clarke, the leading Methodist intellectual of the early 19th century, which Race borrowed from the Westgate Library, assumed that mental world. Although he treated reason as the basic attribute of humanity, he did treat reason as the basic attribute of humanity. All right feeling, he wrote, is formed upon and is the product of right thought. He deplored any blind, irrational impulse and spoke confidently of the laws of mind. He was fascinated by natural science, reading Buffon's Natural History, endorsing Newton's philosophy, and drawing metaphors from chemical solutions. He upheld the Christian version of the idea of progress, the post-millennial expectation of steady human improvement through the advance of the gospel. Although he believed that without divine help the law of human nature meant that evil would prevail, he could write confidently of the progressive development and triumph of Christianity. The theologians that Race initially absorbed were men deeply swayed by the Enlightenment. He quoted the Presbyterian Thomas Chalmers and the Congregationalists Ralph Wardlaw and George Payne as authoritative. Above all, Race found convincing the apologetic case mounted by the 18th century Bishop Butler. The Weardale preacher was sure that the immortal analogy of religion by Butler, who had resided in the valley as rector of Stanhope before being elevated to the episcopal bench, had confuted the deists by means of close reasoning. Race adopted Butler's central case, asking why one should expect there to be no difficulties in discerning the Almighty as the author of the Bible when there were comparable difficulties in seeing him as the author of creation. Reason, science, progress, and the intellectual assumptions associated with them moulded the Weardale preacher in his younger days. Then, however, he discovered Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Race was swept off his feet and could scarcely think or speak of anything else. This introduction to a newer romantic school of thought effected a revolution in his mind. Accepting Coleridge's distinction between reason, a superior intuitive faculty, and understanding, the mental powers praised by the Enlightenment, Race began to incorporate many typical romantic themes into his way of looking at the world. Against the idolaters of intellect, he began to stress the importance of emotion in true religion. He declared that living organisms develop over time, so adopting the natural motif of growth, so common in romantic discourse. He became an advocate of a form of cultural relativism, holding that truth and beauty are to be found in all church polities. And he became an exponent of a peculiar cast of thought and expression derived from the German philosophical literature lying behind Coleridge and their other British imitators. In the manner of Thomas Carlyle, for example, he announced that Christian organisations must embody, symbol forth, and diffuse the power of God to salvation. Race now downgraded the rational case for the validity of Christianity that he derived from the Enlightenment theologians such as Butler and Chalmers as mere logical evidence. The Weardale preacher published 3 articles setting out the value of Coleridge's aids to faith for the benefit of his fellow primitive Methodists, criticising the poet on points of detail, but teaching that he had stripped William Paley and Jeremy Bentham, quintessential exponents of an enlightened philosophy, of their false wreaths. Like his near contemporary John Stuart Mill, George Race, without abandoning a great deal of the legacy of the Enlightenment, had turned to a romantic way of expressing his thought. Race took further steps down the same path. He was not attracted by the ideas of those most under the sway of Coleridge, Morris, and the Broad Churchmen, whom he sometimes bracketed with the Americans Theodore Parker and William E. Channing, dismissing them as transcendentalists. There were, however, echoes in Race's writings of the late 1850s of the moral theory of Kant, and he approved Coleridge's debt to that master. Then he was struck by The Limits of Religious Thought, a book published in 1858 by Henry Mansell, Waynflete Professor of Moral and Metaphysical Philosophy at Oxford. Mansell was applying the reigning philosophical paradigm, Sir William Hamilton's blend of Kant and the Scottish common sense tradition, to religious thought. Hamilton taught that human reason, being part of the conditioned world, cannot rise to grasp the Almighty, who is unconditioned. The very laws of mental operation prohibit rational knowledge of God. Hence, Mansell concluded, we must fall back on supernatural revelation for our understanding of divine things. Race may only have partly grasped Hamilton, but the Weardale preacher saw the Hamiltonian philosophy as a basis of adamant for Mansell's system. The appeal of Mansell was that he presented a short and easy way of confuting rationalists of all descriptions. Race had spent many of his earlier days battling with the influence in the valley of freethinkers such as George Holyoake, and now he'd acquired rational tools for restricting the authority of reason in religion. He therefore published an article on reason, its limits and powers, commending the position of Mansell and quoting slabs of his book. Race was fully aware that the assertion that we cannot know the unconditioned could encourage scepticism, but for Race it led in the opposite direction, to fideism, an exalting of the role of faith. We thus learn, he quoted Mansell as saying, that the provinces of reason and faith are not coextensive, that it is our duty, enjoined by reason itself, to believe in that which we are unable to comprehend. With characteristic independence of mind, Race had broken the intellectual mould in which he had been nurtured. Alongside this remarkable layman, there served over the years a series of primitive Methodist ministers. Because of the Methodist itinerant system, each would stay in Weardale for only 2 or 3 years before being transferred to another station. Among them was Colin McKechnie, who became close to George Race during his time in the valley and who returned afterwards to stay with his old friend. McKechnie was unusual among primitive ministers in coming from Scotland, where the denomination was weak. Born in Paisley in 1821, he spoke Gaelic as a boy, never lost a Scottish accent, and would protest when others criticised his native land. He was perceived as an archetypal Scotsman, sturdy, pushful, painstaking, self-reliant, and gifted with great tenacity of purpose, coupled with endurance. He was expected to enter the Presbyterian ministry, but instead, because of the death of the grandfather who had supported him, he had to leave school early to earn his own keep at the age of 10. Drawn into the Primitives through a brother, he became one of their preachers in 1838 at the age of only 16, because of his obvious abilities. He travelled round places in the north of England, being stationed in Weardale between 1851 and 1853. There, when visiting Westgate, the camaraderie was forged with George Race by staying in his home. Two men attended the 1853 Primitive Methodist Conference in York as visitors together and had the wisdom to spend their time sampling other preachers in the city. Although McKechnie restrained his emotions in the pulpit, he was the leader in 3 revivals in 1851, 1859 and 1867, the first being in Weardale itself. On that occasion, he reported, Stanhope and the neighbourhood were literally deluged with divine influence. McKechnie chafed under the system whereby younger ministers were excluded from the connectional conference until they'd served 12 years as superintendent, colliding with the authorities in the 1850s over the editing of a new hymn book. For some years, he was regarded as something of a troublemaker. It was not until 1865 that he entered conference as a delegate, and only 4 years later, in broken health, he retired from active ministry. Yet his greatest days were still to come. In 1876, he was appointed connectional editor, doubling the circulation of the magazine within 2 years, and having the satisfaction of issuing a superior hymn book in 1886 before retiring in the following year. He was elected president of conference in 1880. McKechnie may have been a stormy petrel in his younger period, but he came to enjoy the entire confidence of his denomination. This Scottish preacher came under a variety of intellectual influences. As a boy, he was entranced by John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. As a young man, he was inspired by Isaac Watts' Improvement of the Mind, and as a recruit to Arminian theology in Calvinist Scotland, he absorbed John Fletcher's checks to antinomianism. He reinforced his Scottish allegiance by reading Boswell's Life of Dr. Johnson and the fiction of Sir Walter Scott. More formative were George Payne's Elements of Mental and Moral Science, a standard guide to its subject, which Race had also digested, and John Foster's essays, especially the one on decision of character. He turned further to the past, reading the 17th century dissenting theologian John Howe, Puritan divines, and Richard Hooker's Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity. Here was a set of authors that would make him a more efficient primitive Methodist preacher, helping to orientate him in the religious world. The greatest impact, however, came from two writers who made more demands on him. One was Jonathan Edwards, whose treatise on the freedom of the will he would read far into the night. He was still wrestling with Edwards at the age of 70, a not uncommon experience, finding the New England theologians' arguments unanswerable, but wondering, as a good Methodist, whether the Calvinistic Edwards might be wrong about the will not being able to make its own choices. Most of all, McKechnie engaged with Bishop Butler. McKechnie's intellect was quickened as a teenager by dipping into the analogy of religion. He returned to its pages for a more careful reading in later life, and when stationed at Stanhope, Butler's former parish in Weardale, McKechnie would walk along the banks of the river, wrapped in a close study of the book. As a widower, he even took the analogy with him on what a colleague called his sweethearting expeditions in quest of a new wife. Among these diverse writers, it was Butler, himself a Weardale author, who did most to brace McKechnie's intellect. The resulting cast of mind was not dissimilar to that of George Race. McKechnie showed a passion for evangelical priorities during his ministry. He rejoiced in conversions, was active in seeking them. He preached the Bible and stressed the prominence there of the cross of Christ, expanding the same governmental theory of the atonement that Race espoused. Like his friend too, McKechnie maintained the central preoccupations of the Enlightenment. He accepted the supremacy of reason, writing of the crowning glory of creation, mind. He was fascinated by science, devouring, for example, Alexander von Humboldt's panoramic treatise on the natural world, Cosmos. He believed fervently in progress in its post-millennial guise, declaring confidently that everywhere there are evidences of progress towards Earth's millennium. He went so far as to suppose, with many of the French philosophes of the later 18th century, that the world would culminate in the intellectual perfection of man. Yet, in many respects, McKechnie, again like Race, transcended the teachings of the Enlightenment. He showed a distinctly romantic taste for the natural setting of the Weardale revival, recounting how the echoes of the surrounding mountains were frequently startled from their slumbering recesses by the shouting of God's newly redeemed ones. He was capable of voicing the characteristic epistemology of the Romantic Revolution, claiming that intuitions of purest truth, richer by far than the mere deductions of logic, flash upon the soul like inspiration. And he also ventured a good way towards cultural relativism by positing that Calvinism and Arminianism were not so much contradictory as the opposite poles of divine truth. What McKechnie did not do, however, was to follow Race down the path of embracing Mansell's fideism. He seems to have been held back by a firmer footing on the rational arguments of Edwards and Butler. But it is evident that McKechnie believed as much as his friend in creating a bold synthesis of the ideas current in his day. If anything, he was more skilled at integrating them into a single system. McKechnie stated his ideal in two lectures delivered to the Young Men's Christian Association at Doncaster in 1862 and 1863. The first, entitled Intellectuality and Religion, argued for a reconciliation of the two elements in his title. His premise was that man is designed by his creator to attain an intellectual character. Too often, he contended, intellectuality and religion were held apart. The intellectual without religion is but half-cultured. Striking instances of this phenomenon were Francis Bacon, the 17th century polymath who was credited with inventing scientific method, and the contemporary German scientist Alexander von Humboldt, neither of whom showed any sign of authentic Christian commitment. Equally, however, the omission of an intellectual component from a religious life was to be deplored. Sometimes, and here the primitive Methodist preacher must have been thinking of many in his flocks, the neglect of the mind was the result of scanty schooling and incessant labour, and so could not be seen as culpable. but in other cases it was a result of negligence. Through lack of will, and here McKechnie's strength of feeling arises, many were content with intellectual dwarfishness and sterility. That form of irresponsibility was inexcusable. It was even worse when intellectuality and religion came into collision. McKechnie condemned, on the one hand, the schools of thought from antiquity down to the present that aimed for the overthrow of religion, and on the other, the popish spirit typified in Rome's condemnation of Galileo, but sometimes seen in Protestant attempts to suppress the free development of mind. The aim should instead be to replicate the profundity of John Foster, the comprehensiveness of Joseph Butler, the consecutive reasoning of Jonathan Edwards, and the forcible teaching of Thomas Chalmers, and ideally to blend them in a single person. McKechnie was nothing if not ambitious. The second lecture, on intellectual religion, took up similar themes. While recognising that Christianity embraces the emotions and will as well as the mind, he insists that mind has the priority. Religion, he declares at the outset, roots itself primarily in the intellect. The intellectual Christian, he goes on to explain, is likely to have come to faith in the same way as any other person, but subsequently feels the need for a reasoned foundation. He can rest, McKechnie argues, on the evidence provided by the substance, the practical results, and the miracles of the faith. The case of David Hume against miracles is groundless. Equally specious are the semi-infidel objections of the recent Broadchurch collection of essays and reviews. The intellectual Christian recognises the unity of religious truth, discerning the connections between the parts of the whole, and understands the relations between Christianity and the truths of science and philosophy. First and foremost, he perceives the need to penetrate to the intellectual substance of biblical teachings that are often clouded by metaphor. Behind the anthropomorphism applied to the Almighty in Scripture, McKechnie sees a purely spiritual being who is free from the grossness of sense. Beyond the imagery of the unquenchable fire of hell, he finds a human psychological state of horror, remorse, and despair. This perspective, identifying a kernel of truths to be believed and being willing to be flexible about much else, was to enable McKechnie to navigate the shoals of later Victorian controversy without shipwreck. When higher criticism began to unsettle many, for instance, he was unconcerned. The scriptures, he said in old age, make no claim to scientific accuracy, nor do they claim in matter of history to be inerrant. They constitute a revelation of moral and spiritual truth, and as such their authority is unaffected by either the discoveries of modern science or literary criticism. While continuing to uphold biblical authority, he was serenely willing to surrender some of its traditional bulwarks. McKechnie practiced what he preached about intellectual Christianity. An eagerness to transmit his relish for ideas to others breathes through the lectures. McKechnie's preeminent trait, according to his obituarist, was the interest he took in the culture of young men. In the autumn of 1849, a group of junior ministers, meeting at a primitive Methodist missionary rally, voiced regrets over their lack of educational attainments. They had received no college preparation for ministry, since the practice in the denomination was still to put preachers into the field as soon as they showed an aptitude for gospel sermons, and so most of them did not even understand how to go about learning. The members of the group decided that they wanted to meet for that Victorian panacea, mutual improvement. It was McKechnie who took the lead in forming a preachers' association of the Sunderland district the following spring. Each year, the members met for 3 days, listening to sermons and presenting papers to each other. The more senior figures gave guidance to the younger in their reading. Some of the papers were submitted to the denominational magazine, but they were rejected by the editor because the authorities feared the new organisation was likely to disturb connectional unity. In 1854, therefore, the group decided to publish its own periodical, The Christian Ambassador, with McKechnie as editor. This was seen as active rebellion, and when a contributor ventured to lament that the connection was less effective than it had been in the past, the journal was peremptorily closed by the authorities. But McKechnie was not to be silenced. He negotiated permission for the periodical to restart on the basis that he would exercise more caution over content. From then on, it appeared regularly, eventually, when McKechnie was serving as connectional editor, turning into the Primitive Methodist Quarterly Review, the denomination's more highbrow journal. It was from this body of men in the Preachers' Association who produced the journal that some of the initial pressure came for the creation of the first denominational training college. McKechnie was once more the leading light, acting as secretary of the conference committee charged with setting up the institution between 1866 and 68. The association, the periodical, and the college were all stages in the same project, the creation of a more intellectual tone within primitive Methodism. It was McKechnie, more than any other man, who was responsible. In the small circle of ministers who, like McKechnie, presided over revivals in Weardale, there were several who were almost as intellectually disposed as he was himself. William Lister was in charge of a revival at Lane Head while he served as minister in Weardale in 1858 and was president of the Connection 10 years later. He was fond of reading as a boy, became connectional book steward, and loved studying theology. It's not surprising that, having worked with McKechnie in bonds of closest affection, Lister should have asked to see his colleague while on his deathbed. Henry Phillips, though preferring ordinary circuit work to revivals, nevertheless believed in backing them when they broke out. An awakening did break out at Frosterley in Weardale in 1861 during Phillips' ministry there, and he reported joyfully that the word of the Lord had free course and was glorified. He was elected president of conference in 1878, showing that he too enjoyed the support of the denomination. Phillips, having been well educated, continued to seek intellectual culture and refinement. Typically, at the close of the revival, he organised Bible classes and book clubs for the converts so as to establish them in the faith. Once more, he was a close friend of McKechnie. Most strikingly of all, John Snaith, a younger minister, came close to fulfilling McKechnie's ideal of an intellectual Christian. Snaith, who had led a revival at Eyemouth in 1859 at the opening of his ministry, went on to enjoy another in 1875, this time in Weardale. He was extremely bookish, reading Bishop Butler by the time he was 16, an astonishing feat, and studying not just the Puritans, but also Plato and Aristotle for himself. He read a paper on Mansell and Hamilton to McKechnie's Preachers' Association before he ceased to be a probationer minister. While travelling in the ministry, Snaith acquired all the works of Hegel in the original German, corresponded with Hutchinson Stirling, the leading British enthusiast for the philosopher, and eventually published a book, The Philosophy of Spirit, 1914, vindicating Hegel's system. Snaith developed a surprising parallel between primitive Methodism and Hegelianism. He pointed out that Hugh Bourne, one of the founders of the denomination, had been born within 18 months of the philosopher, and the year of the first camp meeting that launched primitive Methodism, 1807, was also the date of Hegel's first major work, The Phenomenology of Spirit. The primitives' doctrine of the witness of the Spirit, representing the assured knowledge of God, was equivalent to the Hegelian conviction that the Spirit could be rationally known. Snaith was not just a spinner of curious notions, for he had a firm grasp of the relationship of Hume, Kant, and Hegel, very rare in Britain at that time. He was as aware of the significance of Hegel as almost anybody else in the country on the eve of the First World War. This minister was an extreme example of the intellectual independence that McKechnie recommended. Intellectual Christianity was therefore a reality among the lay people and preachers of a remote valley in the hills of County Durham. There were symptoms of a profound bookishness among the lead miners of Weardale because of their religious allegiance. The Westgate Subscription Library under John Dover Muschamp was a powerful civilizing agency, spreading not just literacy, but a serious engagement with ideas. Its most illustrious member, George Race, was immersed in the primitive Methodist ethos and yet devoted to learning. A brilliant public speaker, he upheld a firm evangelical theology that meshed tightly with the legacy of the Enlightenment, but the discovery of Coleridge turned the current of his thoughts into fresh channels. He accepted the philosophical theology of Mansell and its foundations in Hamilton, reaching the conclusion that faith is superior to reason. The ministers who passed through the valley included Colin McKechnie, a man who shared the intellectual interests of Race. With Scottish thoroughness, he absorbed a range of books, including most significantly The Analogy by Bishop Butler. He blended evangelical, Enlightenment and romantic elements, but did not follow Race in endorsing Mansell. McKechnie was an articulate champion of the goal of integrating intellect with religion. He encouraged his colleagues in the primitive ministry to share his aspirations through the Preachers' Association, the periodical he edited, and his advocacy of a training college. Other ministers who served in Weardale showed scholarly instincts, the supreme instance being John Snaith with his advocacy of Hegel. These primitive Methodists bore no resemblance to the image of nonconformists that Matthew Arnold projected in Culture and Anarchy of 1869, an image of ignorant Philistines having no higher delights than tea meetings. Race, if a little angular, and McKechnie, if a little tentative, were more like Newman's model in The Idea of a University, 1873, of a rounded product of a refined academy. Intellectuality was successfully combined with evangelical religion in this corner of England. Hence, revivalism was not necessarily mindless. Primitive Methodists, with their camp meetings, were noted for their eagerness for revival. The members of the denomination in Weardale were no exceptions, experiencing a succession of awakenings down the century, the decade of the 19th century. William Lister, Henry Phillips and John Snaith all participated in large-scale, spontaneous movements of this kind in the valley. George Race and Colin McKechnie worked together in another in Stanhope in 1851. The same people were men of revivalist spirit and intellectual attainment. Nor were the two preoccupations kept apart. In what McKechnie thought Race's finest essay, Conversion, the Abiding Miracle of Christianity, the layman argued that the transformation of bad men into good men among the masses was the most powerful apologetic argument for the validity of Christian truth. Scholarly defences of the faith had their place, he believed, but striking conversions of the kind experienced in revival were more persuasive. In an awakening, he wrote, "A ray of glory is revealed, brighter than ever was coruscated by the learning and genius of a Butler or a Chalmers." Religious experience could not be gainsaid. This point of view was to become more general among broadening evangelicals in later years. As the traditional appeal to the text of the Bible seemed to become embroiled in greater difficulties, they turned instead to the evidence of experience. That was the standpoint of the influential Congregationalist R.W. Dale in his Living Christ and the Four Gospels of 1890, and it was the case developed by many Methodists afterwards. That line of thinking may have entailed peril, reducing Christianity too much to a matter of subjectivity. It may indeed have weakened the intellectual presentation of the faith and so have contributed ultimately to the process of secularization. Yet, in its day, when part of a thoughtful analysis of the human condition, the stress on the experience of conversion exerted considerable persuasive power. Men of high scholarly calibre showed that they regarded religious awakenings and hard thinking as harmonising. The people of Victorian Weardale reveal that revivalism in its Methodist form, far from being an anti-intellectual influence, could be a force that cultivated the human mind. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. That was really great. We have time for some questions, and we have 2 microphones here in the aisles. So if you have a question for Dr. Bebbington, if you could approach the microphone, and we'll do that. I wanted to take the prerogative to ask the first question. Is there a correlation between a decline of radical evangelicalism and this intellectual emphasis? In other words, is this a sign that these primitive Methodists are becoming progressively moderate evangelicals and not the sort that are focusing on the Pentecostal showers? Was that the phrase? And people falling in the aisles and screaming and this sort of thing. In other words, is this part of the process of them becoming polite and refined?
In large measure, yes. Over time, the descendants of these people started moving to the towns and putting up nicer chapels with more resplendent architecture, having kneeling mats for their devotions, and generally becoming more respectable. However, there is this phase before that happens when there is, as it were, a tensile strength in their amalgam of revivalism of a radical kind and intellectual quest, and indeed in large measure intellectual attainment too. And that is a phenomenon that has almost entirely disappeared from the secondary literature. I think it's important to reinstate it, because that tensile strength may in fact be something that can be reinstated not just into the historiography, but into the real world.
Thank you. Coming up with your questions, and if you could identify yourself when you ask your question, that would be great. And David will
Thank you.
take your question.
Longer considered a worker and part of that community. Do you find in your study of these Methodists in Weardale that the people who become Methodists and start to move into this life of the mind and the life of intellectual Christianity lose that sort of identity or that tie with other workers? Or do you find that, tell me more about working class Methodism in that world and the extent to which it counters the ethics that the E.P. Thompson was talking about at the working class.
Thank you. Some of those who were born and brought up in Weardale did indeed become educated and moved away, often to the towns, and did become suburban and ceased to be working class. Indeed, in the last quarter of the 19th century, there is a very marked shift of primitive Methodists into small shopkeeping. They followed the example of George Race and started selling things on street corners. However, that's a minority. The vast majority of primitive Methodists, especially miners, especially coal miners, I was not talking about them, but they were very strong in County Durham. They remained in their mining communities, partly because they were communities, very tight-knit, with the chapels of the focus of sociability. And in those places, those who became educated became the leaders of their working class communities. Again and again, they became trade union leaders. And in the years between about 1880 and about 1930, the trade unions of England and indeed of Wales and of Scotland were led by precisely that type of man who remained working class, come up through the mines, but was very educated, and who preached on political platforms and secured votes through going into all the histrionics of a revivalist preacher. There was a blending of politics and religion amongst these people, but they remained the trusted representative of the working classes, and they are the pioneers of the labour movement in Britain, which ultimately produced Tony Blair. Oh, I'm sorry, that might not be a good thing. Thank you. Where's the one? Right.
Barry Hankins, Baylor. I'm wondering if you, I don't want to get you off on another chapter here, but I'm wondering if you've gotten far enough into R.E.B. Baylor, Judge Baylor, the Brazos revival, to just give us a glimpse of how it stacks up intellectually against Weardale. Kind of thinking of Baylor versus Weardale. Not necessarily Baylor versus Oklahoma.
With great pleasure. In the year 1841, the central year of the history of the free and independent sovereign Republic of Texas, before Texas was assimilated to the United States, there was a revival in Washington on the Brazos, which is a good way down the river, in the very building where Texas independence had been declared 5 years earlier. This revival was amongst the Baptists of this town. There were only 100 people then living in this town, and all of them attended the revival without exception. The leader of the revival was a judge who sometimes doubled in the pulpit as a preacher, and occasionally, unfortunately, confused the two roles. So from the pulpit he would say, "And members of the jury," and pull himself up. He would sometimes also start weeping in the pulpit. Judge Baylor was a very remarkable man. He presided over a revival which in 1841 transformed that town. Previously it had been notorious as a haunt of card sharps and lovers of horse riding, and especially of the gambling that was associated with horse riding. Gambling was technically prohibited by the laws of Texas at the time, but it happened at Washington in abundance. There was actually a horse racing area just south of the town. So it was an area dominated by rough culture, as it was called. The revival stopped that. Instead of having young men who satirized preachers by imitating the sound of the preacher praying the Lord's Prayer on a violin outside the window while he was doing it to put him off, and things of that sort, counter theatre designed to subvert evangelical religion became the dominant force in the town. As a result, one of the wives of one of the deacons of the church wrote to her sister, who was the second wife of Samuel Houston, and urged that they should transfer the capital to this cleaned up city the following year. So they did. And Washington on the Brazos became the capital of Texas as a result of this revival. What is more, they realized that they needed lots of educated preachers to carry on the good work that Baylor had begun. So, only 3 months after that revival, in the same town, the same people who had the revival said, "We will form a Baptist Education Society for Texas in order to create an academical institution." And they did so in order to carry on the influences of this revival. That institution is now Baylor University. This revival, therefore, is responsible for this very building in which we are now seated. An important revival. Firstly, in relation to preaching, women very soon dropped out of primitive Methodist preaching. They were quite common in the very first 2 decades, when it was simply a revival movement rather than denomination. But as it tightened up its orders, its system, women ceased to be preachers as official denominational preachers. They sometimes still conducted services as local preachers. In fact, quite a number of services were conducted in that way, and that never ceased in primitive Methodism, and it hasn't ceased to this day in some of their chapels, not least in this area. But as official ministers, as it were, it did cease. The women were not, by and large, the people who subscribed to the library, and what we have as a source for the library is the official book, begun in 1788 and continued right down to its closure 5 years ago, very sadly. And the people who subscribed are from my examination, without exception, male. However, we do not know who read the books when they were taken home, and they were taken out for a whole month. And I can't imagine if 4 books were borrowed that all would have been read by the man the whole time. And indeed, the statistic that I gave earlier on would tend to confirm that. Okay, male literacy was higher at 96%, but female literacy was 90%, and that is exceptionally high. The female literacy rate amongst the coal mining population in the same county in the same year was round about 30%. So undoubtedly, the literary influences spread to the women, and they would undoubtedly have read the Sunday school library books and some of the other sources of intellectual stimulation as well. And they heard the sermons. And George Race's sermons were nothing if not intellectual at times. So the intellectual culture did embrace the women to a certain degree. And I know that for one specific reason, actually. In the year 1850, there was a big bust-up in the Stanhope Primitive Methodist Chapel. And the person who was most articulate in that bust-up was a woman. She was able to play a full part in debates about whether or not they should have a choir. And she had very strong feelings because she was from Yorkshire.
Michael Kunis, professor at Catherine University. I was intrigued by your identification on John Smythe's part with Methodism, with Hegelian thought. Last week in one of my classes, one of my students identified Hegelian being Dorian Gray.
Right.
And we also were looking at Marx and his empirical basis for judgment based on Hegel. And I'm wondering if there was something in the zeitgeist at the time that the primitive Methodists were appealing to that they saw could be effective in terms of their evangelism in looking for experience as a witness and not just appealing to the ethics of the Bible.
I think that it is correct that they wanted to look at experience, and that is a large part of the thrust of what George Race in his mature thought was trying to say, that experience is the best vindicator of the validity of the Christian religion, better than any form of argumentation. However, what Snaith was concerned with, centrally, was to argue that mere subjectivity feeling the Manselian Hamiltonian paradigm that Race had embraced is inadequate, precisely because it divorced faith from reason. What he wanted to insist on was that Hegel was right to merge faith and reason, to see the apprehension of Geist, in Hegelian terms, as a rational process, the meeting of mind with mind, indeed mind being part of mind. And therefore, for Snaith, there was no emphasis on experience over and above rationality. On the contrary, he saw that as a threat to truth in religion. And I think it's very interesting that he produced 2 sons who are able intellectual primitive Methodist preachers and a grandson who became a very distinguished theologian, New Testament scholar more particularly, in the 1950s and 60s, Norman Snaith, whose name may be known to some in this room, so that the emphasis on the cruciality of rationality in religion was transmitted down the generations. Norman Snaith may still have a son in the Methodist ministry this day, for all I know. So, yes and no on that. Rationality was very important to some of them, and that's what they saw in Hegel. Those who read him. Not everybody read Hegel.
Well, I'm sure some of you may have other questions for Dr. Bebbington, and he'll be around. I'm sure glad to take your questions tonight or at another time during the conference. But we have food waiting over here, and so let's give him another round of applause for his talk.